Hello, I'm the Rev.Dr. Yvonne Seon and a former Unitarian Universalist minister. I've done some other things as well, but that's what we're talking about right now for today.
My name is Felicia Chapelle, and I'm here to ask my mother some questions about her time with the Unitarian Universalists. I'd like to start, Mom, by asking you about your time with your grandmother with the Garden of Gethsemane.
That was a very important and formative time of my life. I lived with my grandmother from time to time, or off and on, when I was growing up. Um, on occasion, my mother would be working out of town, and my grandmother would be taking care of me, and so I lived at her house with my cousins.
Tell us about her spirituality and how that influenced you.
My grandmother had a ministry in her home as well, and growing up, I would see people come into her house, walk up the steps in crutches. She would lay hands on them, and I remember very clearly one day a woman who had gone up in crutches came running down the steps holding the crutches in her hand and shouting praises to God for her healing. And we knew she had been healing because she couldn't walk, much less run, when she had come into the house.
Describe the atmosphere at the Garden of Gethsemane. What did it look like?
The Garden of Gethsemane was a room in the upper, on the second floor, the upstairs floor of my grandmother's house. It was the only room with a window facing to the east. It had a single window facing to the east, and that was the window she used to pray from, because it was facing toward Jerusalem, I guess.
So tell us about how her spirituality influenced your own relationship with what became the Garden of Gethsemane under your leadership.
Well, for one thing, it made me aware that healing was possible, that a healing ministry would be welcomed in some places.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about your education in terms of being a PhD as well as receiving your MDiv from Howard. Can you tell us a little bit about having small children and still pushing forward with your goals academically?
My one memory that's significant in that regard is of a day when I lost my track of my son while we were at the School of Divinity. And when I came out, someone told me, I saw your son on the roof. That was scary because, of course, when one is on the roof, one can fall, and I didn't want to have anything happen to him on my watch, especially not at the Divinity School. But apart from that, everybody was involved. Everyone knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. And they were all, for the most part, cooperative, but they were also children. And they would also be playing or getting into mischief, as children often do.
After you started your congregation, did you find that you were warmly received or well supported by the UU Association?
I think the answer to that is no, but I tend to forget the bad memories, and so I'm not really sure what the answer to that question is, except that there were bad memories.
Overall, what was your experience in that regard?
Overall, I as I say, I don't remember the bad memories, and I don't remember much about that time.
Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with Reverend Eaton at the All Souls Unitarian Church?
Reverend Eaton was very supportive of me um, at a time when women were not being acknowledged as ministers or being um, given much attention. He was welcoming and um, encouraging and supportive.
And that's where you were ordained?
I don't remember where I was ordained. I don't think I was ordained at All Souls.
No, you were ordained at All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church.
Oh, okay. I'm glad you remembered. Yes, yes, he was very supportive and he ordained me.
Despite the fact that we have many more ministers of color with the Unitarian Universalists, and notably in the ministry, since you and Adele Smith Penniman broke in, we know that these women still struggle to be accepted in their leadership. What could your retired colleagues do to help support these women who are having to struggle?
Well, I think one thing that we could do would be to attend services under their leadership uh, and just be part of the congregation and listen to what they are saying. We could critique them if after we have heard the service, we could give them any critique that we had, and I think that should. I think our presence is very important and should help to encourage others to do this, to do likewise, to sit in on them, to listen to them, to critique them if necessary. Uh, and that means that can be good or bad. Uh, we can critique them and say how wonderful they were, how well they did, or we could critique them with comments for their improvement. But I think supporting them in that way is the best thing that we can do for them.
Is there anything else you'd like to say to your colleagues?
Just to encourage my colleagues to welcome women, to support women, to listen to the women who come to into leadership in their during their time there, and to let the women ministers know any feedback from their lives that may impact on what they are doing.
We really appreciate you sharing with us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And it's really wonderful to hear from Yvonne for her Odyssey. Reading her essay in Darkening the Doorways that was mailed out, this is a reminder, I think, of how valuable it is to tell our stories from our own perspectives and with the particulars which get lost. So I appreciate that was so thoroughly written, beautifully written. And she begins by saying that the Sojourner Truth Congregation was an experiment in diversity and that it grew from ideas that a number of people held for the ministry of the first African-American woman ordained in our UU ministry. And then Yvonne adds, my ministry. So when someone breaks a stained glass ceiling, as Yvonne certainly did, they can become kind of an icon or a symbol, a token, an exemplar, a model, and a story of validation for UU anti-racism. Yvonne was living that ministry as her own self, a person called to ministry. And she notes that the congregation's story cannot be separated from my personal journey. For what was personal to her was really often political, I think, in the eyes of other people. When Yvonne started her MDiv at Howard in the 1970s. She already had a PhD, as you mentioned, international work experience, and an unusually deep and broad experience of the faith traditions of humanity. And so she reached the milestone of being first as a highly qualified and capable minister. And yet, when she sought a professional position over the next 8 years through the settlement system at the UUA, she did not get a match. She was called to ministry, but congregations were not ready to call her to their ministries. At that time, the UUA had really two official routes into paid positions. The then settlement office in the then Department of Ministry and the Extension Ministry Department. So some of you lived through this, know all about it. But just to summarize, Extension was geared toward new starts and revitalizing diminished congregations. In the metaphor of the time, it was a growth program designed to transform cat congregations into dog congregations. These efforts were funded by a grant from Shelter Rock, and that was used to provide subsidies to pay for various ministries. A lot of encouragement came from the Urban Church Coalition, and so these efforts in Extension became a center of the UUA's anti-racism aspirations. It was observed by many of us at the time that we often put our newest clergy and our clergy with marginalized identities into the toughest situations in ministry. The ideal at that time was an entrepreneurial minister. Well, Yvonne completely fit the bill for that. She started the Garden of Gethsemane as a congregation when she was still a ministry student at Howard, and it evolved into the renamed Sojourner Truth congregation. She had already drawn together a core congregation when it became an extension ministry. Now, the other avenue, and she pursued this avenue for positions, was the Department of Ministry Settlement Office, which at the time operated by sending out curated lists of names to congregations in search. A few years after Sojourner Truth closed its doors, I became the director of ministry. And in our goal of being more inclusive, more transparent, more just, more fair, the settlement system was totally revamped to become a system of open choice. Ministers could express their own interests, and it went online, which also changed it a lot. And this was all done with the leadership of John Weston. And so to Wayne's question, how did the UU settlement systems limit women and women of color? Well, a few bullet points, really. I think there are the obvious issues of sexism and racism. I mean, duh, big issues. But few others. White feminists were not prepared to be allies for women of color. In many ways, those of us who were white didn't have a lot of power in the system at the time that Yvonne was at Sojourner Truth and looking. There was an issue of paternalistic selection to be on lists for open pulpits during most of the time that she was in search. There was a problem of using women and women of color as tokens on those lists. So, a curated list would be made with a woman or a person of color, or maybe a twofer woman person of color. And that would give a search committee and a congregation a sense that they'd really looked at a diverse list. But it wasn't really geared toward assisting with the changes and the resistance in the congregations. There was also the historic expectations that ministers would uproot themselves to move to a desirable ministry, just like, bingo, I pick up my family and go, which wasn't as realistic for historic reasons. And there was limited support of extension ministries. Yvonne wrote in her essay that the money ran out. So some of you in this group are more familiar with that era of extension than I am. You may have served in that. You may have led many of the efforts. You might have liaisoned. You might have been a buddy church to a starting up church. So I think it would make a wonderful thesis project. I don't think it's been totally summarized anywhere in a written form, not that I'm aware of. But I think we should ask ourselves these questions. What did we do right? What mistakes were made? And what did we learn? Looking back, from my perspective, I see that we made some steps forward, but not without cost and pain. I know that ministry happened, lives were enriched, blessed, healed, and inspired. So thank you, Yvonne, for your part in that.
Where Reverend Seon began, and that is in her grandmother's house, with the votive candles and the incense, pictures of Mahatma Gandhi and Marcus Garvey, statue of Buddha, prayer rug facing east, and her greeting every visitor in the Arabic language, Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be upon you. She recognized the need to address the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. So she fed those physically that needed food, and she healed those that were in pain and suffering. And meanwhile, Rev.Dr. Yvonne was experiencing and observing all of this. The prayer room on the second level. But let's move now to the diverse faith traditions that she was exposed to. Pentecostalism, Baptist, Episcopalian, Catholicism, and later on in life, African religions. So she's becoming interfaith and ecumenical. She's becoming a Unitarian Universalist and not even being aware of it. Because when she was in college, she was sounding like a UU, questioning the Trinity, questioning the divinity of Jesus, questioning the use of communion. And so she was already starting to think and appear like a Unitarian Universalist. And then along the way, she has these wonderful mentors and guides, the Rev.Dr. Lee Edward Wright, who actually healed some visual impairment that she experienced. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. The Reverend David Eaton, and of course, Rev.Dr. Jean Reeves. So she had these amazing mentors along the way. I want to talk about whether or not things would be different now. And I would certainly hope so, because we're talking about the difference of 41 years. So I'm just going to say absolutely things would be different, but I'm going to say why they would be different. They would be different because now we have BLUE, Black Lives Unitarian Universalists. We have DRUM, Diverse and Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministry. We have Ministerial Sisterhood UU. We have UU Christian Fellowship, UU Mystics in Community, UU Spiritual Directors Network, UU Women's Federation. I'm listing these organizations because none of these, with the exception of the UU Christian Fellowship, existed when she came in. So she did not have the kind of support and there were not organizational structures in place to provide that kind of collegiality and the kind of support that she needed. Yes, women were coming in at that time, but they were not Black women, and there's some differences. And Diane alluded to some of them in terms of the racism. I'm not even going to address the racism and the sexism because those are a given. What I do want to talk about is what I'm calling the religious intolerance. It's ironic that our roots are in Judeo-Christianity, and yet Unitarian Universalism has a bias toward Christianity. And so to not only be Christian, but she's coming in with Pentecostal faith healing. And this isn't a person who read about this and is theorizing about it. She has personally experienced healing. And she also, if you remember from the essay, she has been a vessel and a channel for healing. The young child whose hand was injured and her intervening. So she is coming in with grandma's DNA, having experienced and observed what she took in as a child, and then a lifetime of beginning to internalize, practice a lot of this. The religious intolerance is something I suspect she wasn't prepared for. And it's something that we really have to look at the biases that we have toward Christianity within Unitarian Universalism. I ran across a survey just recently that said, and it was done in 1999 by the UUA, I believe, that 9 out of 10 of our UU congregations are humanists. I was surprised that the percentage was so high. I think that some of the tension and biases historically have created the kinds of resistance that impacted Rev.Dr. Yvonne. So there's the religious intolerance that we really have to look at. But there's another factor that I think is even more subtle, and I call it cultural chauvinism, because we embrace shamanism and indigenous faith healers when they're Eastern or any tradition except for Christianity. So that's the cultural chauvinism, that our biases around Christianity extend deep and wide. I think it's something that we really have to look at. And I think that she was unfortunately a victim of these kinds of biases, this kind of religious intolerance. So those were some thoughts that came to mind. And yet I named some organizations in 2022 that she would be welcomed and embraced by, that she would have sacred space and be able to, I trust, I hope, experience the kind of inclusion and the kind of diverse thinking. In preparation for this, I actually went back and looked at the sources that we draw from. In the very first one, quote, direct experience of that mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a removal of the spirit. And I thought, well, if we can shift spirit, why can't there be a healing of the physical body? And why are we so suspicious and distrustful of that? But then that's a whole nother conversation. It's a whole nother conversation, but it is something to think about. And I don't want to dwell on that too long, but I would like to close with a letter from Yvonne and it's dated March 10th, 2014, to Mark Morrison Reed. Sankofa is a wonderful trove of resources, and I found this letter there. She says, I am moved, dear Mark, I am moved to tell you that your book on Black pioneers in a white denomination is one of the things that kept me sane as I sought to find my place in Unitarian Universalist ministry. I knew that the problem was not me or my mental state, but something much more related to the history and future of the denomination, thanks to you. Rereading this letter brought up many painful memories and reminded me of your book. Things have changed considerably now, but many good things came about because of my pain, to paraphrase an Oscar acceptance speech I heard. Anyway, this is just my way of saying thank you for your role in creating change by holding up the mirror. My experience is just one more reflection of your truth. Hope all is well for you and your wife. Send me your news when you have time. Sincerely, Yvonne Seon. P.S. I don't remember if the letter was actually mailed. Yes, Rev.Dr., it was mailed because Mark archived it in the Sankofa collection. But she hints at some of the painful experiences that she had. She's so gracious. If you notice in her essay and in the video, she did not name particulars, but she alludes to some of the challenges and experiences. We may never know what she truly experienced. I hope that from this point forward, we will be more inclusive. We will work on those issues where we still have biases and intolerances, and that we will truly live out the principles and purposes of Unitarian Universalism. And so I salute the Rev.Dr. Yvonne for being the first, because one thing that I recognize is when you're the first of anything, the challenges that you face are just incredible. So I stand on her shoulders and I thank her for paving the way and making it possible for me and others like me. May it be so, and blessed be.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. I appreciate that. And I'm really want to thank Diane and Qiyamah for their comments as well. Those were wonderful. So the thing that really strikes me about this is I looked at this and reread the chapter and watched the video in preparation for this, is a little bit that how much things stay the same and they change and yet they stay the same, because there's so much of this that we almost heard almost mirrored accounts of this as we took the testimony for the Commission on Institutional Change, which was only over like the last 5 years. And so I think it's important to think about the ways that these really don't change. And what is interesting is that people continue to face the kind of issues that she faced, including the settlement system. And there's a saying often among our people with marginalized identities, members of the majority culture, if you want, in terms of race, but global majority, but is that you are often always a bridesmaid, but never a bride. And it is very common for people, and Diane is, I see shaking the head, nodding the head there, that, you know, they will end up having to do 7 to 9 pre-candidates, which sounds like a great thing, except that they're there to show that the committee considered diversity, but then they have to do the 7 to 9 because they're not likely to get any of those calls necessarily. So that continues. And the other piece about, I recall the late Reverend Chester McCall, who we lost during the COVID years, saying to me at one point, why is one of the most challenging ministers in the UUA paired with one of the most challenging congregations. Why would they put us together? What is the point of this, right? In a despairing conversation we had late one night. So I would say that these things continue to be true. And I think it's really important to recognize that the multiple, when people face multiple identities that we find challenging in our majority culture as Unitarian Universalists, that the difficulty is that they don't always get to have support from any single body. I so appreciated the list that was read of the different organizations that exist now that didn't exist in Yvonne's time. But I think it's important to recognize that that these often that they don't feel the same kind of kinship with the majority in those, even in those sort of narrowed organizations, because they share a different identity. And I think it's really important. I want to also address specifically the question that you raise about the discrimination against Reverend Dr. Seon as a woman, and that continues to be live and well in our ministry, which seems a little bit, antithetical in a time when we have a majority of female identified ministers, but it continues to be real, and I think that is something that is very important to name, that she felt that she was, and I think it's just as Reverend Dr. Qiyamah said in such a wonderful way, and that is that she was surprised by the religious discrimination. So she spoke about that in her interview, right? She was surprised by, I suspect, the fact that she was discriminated upon as a woman, more perhaps than what she expected, which was to be discriminated upon as a Black person. And so I think that's where you see those different emphases in her remarks, because I think that continued to perhaps at some level puzzle her as to why that was true when she expected the other. There's one other area that I want to touch on about this, and this question about how we face these multiple oppressions. And I want to note that this is one of those areas where I think mentorship and learning from history is so important, because those intentional multicultural, anti-racist New Start congregations, that little experiment that we did has never been fully mined for the depth of lessons it could give to us in today's times. And that's been true since I wrote The Arc of the Universe, and that has been almost 20 years ago now, right? So, and those files I found in the UUA in a little filing cabinet in a back room. They said, oh yeah, those files are in here, just go right at them. They were just sitting there, and it was tragic to me, because I also, as did Qiyamah, we were both involved in different congregations that were part of that effort. And I think those were really important congregations, but to the issue of multiple oppressions, because they did serve people who were very marginalized. And the congregation I was involved in Durham, North Carolina, I did serve them as a professional while I was waiting, because I was off the settlement system cycle for 6 months. But I also served them more as a lay leader. I was one of their first presidents. And I think that one of the things we faced was the paucity of resources that we had. There was an intentional New Start congregation that started the same year that we did in the Methodist Church, and they were given $250,000 a year to start the congregation, and we were given $50,000. And they're still around. And All Souls we were proud, it was the last one to finally peter out. It dragged on at a very minimal level for many years, but it did just finally end. And I think there's so much to be learned about what we value and what we don't value in that. And so I just want to respect it, because Reverend Dr. Seon's ministry was one that we kept talking about in our efforts. We were always looking at what they had done and trying to be informed by that. And yet we had to do it through a very indirect channel, because there was never an effort to even bring us together in order to let us share what we had learned. And that, I think, is a great tragedy. So.